All right, folks, welcome back. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am a founder and general partner of 8-Bit Capital, along with Jonathan Abrams. You probably know him. And I also have a podcast, and this is it, and it's the Something Ventured podcast, and thank you for listening. It's an old Steve Martin joke. Really, thank so many of you for listening. You know, I started this podcast, thinking, you know, I think in Silicon Valley there's probably a space, who knows, maybe for more interesting, more thoughtful, deeper, maybe funnier conversations than some of what we're getting. And so I tried it out. You know, had a few people on, had a couple heart-to-heart conversations, and boy, it turns out you guys wanted to hear it. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your listening. We're going to have a great year next year, too. Of course, the implication of that, guys, is that, those of you listening are a little more thoughtful, funnier than everyone else. So why don't we keep this podcast between us? Just you and me. All right. So I had an idea, and I know we've covered this joke on the podcast. What's the last thing the drummer said before getting kicked out of the band? Hey, folks, I have an idea for a song. But, you know, my idea in this, it was the word annus horribilis. You know, I don't know. I went to public high school. But by the way, 2020, the year Princess Diana died, the Queen of England at the whatever speech she gives to the country at the end of the year said, "It is not a year upon which I will look back with undiluted pleasure." What a turn of phrase. But anyway, 2020, some people call it annus horribilis, but we had some great guests on the podcast, some amazing conversations. By the way, if you don't like Donald Trump, he got voted out of office. If you don't like COVID, hey, turns out we have a couple of vaccines that work. So cheer up, folks. But my idea was, we had these great guests on this year. How do I thank the guests? Maybe I should write a blog post. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous. I have a podcast. Why would I write a blog post? So I thought, what if I did a podcast? Like, could I do it? Could I thank everybody? Could I do it in about 5 minutes? Would it be interesting? Could I do it in one take? Let's find out. So I'm going to quickly run through, thank the people who are on the podcast this year. Now, I'm not going to thank you, Mark, thank you, Trey, etc. That's not how it works. If you watch it in memoriam, they don't mourn each person who passed. They celebrate the highlights. And certainly I'm not going to celebrate the life highlights of each of these guests, but maybe say a quick word about what each one did on the podcast, what they said on the podcast this year, what it was about, what it triggered in me, and just appreciate these guests. And if you're listening for the first time, and I know every week more and more of you are coming here, again, keep this a secret. It's just us guys. As more and more people come and sort of experience this podcast, maybe as I tell you who we talked to this year, you'll say, hey, that sounds like something I need to hear about. I'm going to go back and listen. So here we go. This is the 2020 Thank You Cast Extravaganza. Let's see if I can do this. Welcome back. All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. This is the episode. I'm going to be brief here, and it's just going to be me. And I'm going to thank and really briefly, reflect on the Something Ventured guests this year. I don't know if this has ever been done in a podcast. Maybe we're making podcast history, folks. But here we go with the guests of 2020 and a quick thank you and a quick summary of what we talked about. Thanks for coming back, folks. Marco Zappacosta, Thumbtack, we started out with him. Thumbtack is I'm curious to hear how he's doing now. Thumbtack, we talked, it was one of the few last I did in person in 2020, as I don't know if you've been paying attention, but COVID hit, so in-person podcasts stopped being a thing, which is really fine, but not great and not awesome. I've always liked being face-to-face with somebody in a room. Anyway, Marco built Thumbtack. Thumbtack is a thing that helps you get jobs done around the house. And I imagine, I don't recall what happened, but I think they got hit pretty hard by COVID. I'm not sure if it's an Airbnb story, though, where maybe as people stayed at home, Thumbtack had some kind of recovery. Keller Fitzsimmons. She was great. She's written a book, Lost in Startuplandia, about depression in Silicon Valley. And her story it's an incredible story. She's an entrepreneur. She started her own company, what an entrepreneur does. Very successful, but at some point in her life, literally lost her ability to read. Looked at a page and just couldn't read it. And recovered from that. And it's an amazing story, and it's an amazing look at, a serious issue. And we look at serious issues on this podcast, but, a look at depression in Silicon Valley. Jeff Macpherson, it's interesting. Jeff is a very successful guy, and it's interesting in some circles to be famous for something that was a thing a little while ago. And he was one of the creators of Tiki Bar TV. And if you don't know what Tiki Bar TV is, this is a great episode. And not only is it about Tiki Bar TV, was this, look it up online. It was this kind of amazing web TV show that was about people. It's like anything. If you explain it, it sounds ridiculous. People hanging out in a tiki bar, and then they would give you a cocktail recipe at the end of it. Not only is this an interesting story about Tiki Bar TV, but also about Apple and the beginning of podcasts, believe it or not, and sort of what emerged when YouTube came out and why webisodes didn't become a thing. And YouTube became user-generated content, but it became what it became, eventually like TikTok videos and dances, not webisodes like Tiki Bar TV. Brianne Kimmel. Brianne Kimmel, we're getting down to, she's one of the last few people in person. Brianne, Work-Life Ventures. I've tried to have as many female venture capitalists, otherwise known as venture capitalists, on to tell their stories as possible. Great investor, very cool person, and tells a little, one of those stories when you listen to this podcast and you just hear it out of the corner of you kind of catch what someone's saying, you don't quite register it. But her story about how at public events she would feel threatened and leave early, and it's a terrible part of what we deal with in Silicon Valley, but you'll hear it, you'll hear it over and over again here on Something Ventured. Paul-Henri Ferrand. I don't know what happened. He was at Brex. This guy's one of the top dog at Google, then a top dog at Brex, and he's since moved on to Babylon Health. So here's a guy, immigrant, obviously, maybe not obviously, but an immigrant, and boys, he's an alpha dog and a pretty interesting guy to listen to. Matt Hulett, Rosetta Stone. Since Matt was on the podcast, he was truly, I'm going to keep saying this, I think he really was one of the last. Maybe it was Promise Phelon, but he was one of the last people on. Matt Hulett, executive at Expedia, and was running Rosetta Stone. Since he's been on the podcast, Rosetta Stone, which was a public company, has been bought by a private equity company. Mike Stutz, fan favorite. Mike Stutz is a TV producer, and he talked about he's actually moved to Arkansas, where he is successfully continuing his career in producing TV. And he talked about now this was right as COVID hit, he talked about the early impact of COVID on the film industry. And I'm not sure everything we predicted came to pass. One thing we talked about was how it works when TV is and is not aware. So there was a time when TV was not aware of September 11th. Like that wasn't a concept, and there was a time when it was a concept. And he said, look, TV will get to a point where it's a concept that COVID happened. Joe Garofoli, two fan favorites in a row. Joe Garofoli is the senior political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, arguably the paper of record for liberals in California, perhaps around the world. He's talked to everybody, Congress, Senate, et cetera, and he always says, great time, and always a great look at how politics affects the country, California, and then Silicon Valley in particular. As COVID hit, I had Kaiser Kuo on. Kaiser is really a bridge between China and the United States. And if you want to hear a really thoughtful analysis of how COVID, really started, what the implications really are, what China really did, how U.S.-China relations work, in a thoughtful, remember that's one of the themes of this podcast, not jingoistic way, interesting guy to hear from. Eric Tarczynski. Eric Venture capitalists have angles. We focus on work-life balance. We focus on, whatever it is, fintech. And Eric's angle is colleges. He has, if you like this thesis, he's the guy who has a network of college students. And what he invests in is people at colleges, and built an amazing network of people. Pretty interesting if you want to hear what's going on at college campuses. Listen to Eric. Somesh Dash, what a great guy and a great friend, and what a thoughtful thinker on Silicon Valley. When a guy's where he is, he's at IVP. It's this multi-billion-dollar venture firm. He's incredibly successful. He really took an emotional pause and said, let's think about what Silicon Valley can do better. And by the way, folks, there's a Langston Hughes poem in that podcast. You do not get that on, you don't get that on other Silicon Valley podcasts. Black Lives Matter. Matter's happened. It's always been happening and it's still happening. But that movement became a thing in the summer. And so I had a few guests on. Monique Woodard, another great venture capitalist, African-American woman, and not okay. Was not doing okay during this time. And the podcast is called Monique Woodard is Not Doing Okay. The joke being whenever somebody asks you how you're doing, great, okay, killing it. And she gives a pretty straightforward and raw, accounting of how she was doing during this period. Takes us to Michael Ellison. What a great Codepath. He runs an organization called Codepath with his partner, Nate, and Nathan, and they are just doing the incredible work of educating people who don't have appropriate access in college. And I will never explain this right, but they are making sure that thousands of people who would not have the opportunity have the opportunity to write code. And so, I had a couple black folks, couple African-American folks come on who are amazing in their own right, but to talk about Black lives, and he was one of those. Promise Phelon was the next one. And if you don't know Promise, listen to this podcast. She's a spectacularly successful executive, has can do anything, and kind of ponders what her next move in life is in this podcast. And she's just an incredible woman and a lovely woman. And I'm going to finally say it. She was the last human that I had here in person on the podcast. But on we go on Zoom. I had Scott Simpson on. Who's Scott Simpson? He's a funny guy. He is a comedian. He was an early executive at Apple. Maybe not early at Apple, but early on in the podcast world. Did whatever he did, made whatever he made at Apple, and left and started. And I recommend it if it ever comes back. If shoulder-to-shoulder comedy ever comes back, and it's got to, Cheaper Than Therapy was just a fantastic San Francisco improv troupe. He went from being an executive at Apple to being a comedian, and he talks about the future of comedy under COVID. And it's one of those things, a live comedy event that just really doesn't work over Zoom. Parker Conrad's an entrepreneur. He's a real entrepreneur. He did it before. There was some controversy in his previous, here, I'll tease this one for you. Some controversy in his previous company. And he talks about how he builds here Rippling, and talks about the controversy in the previous company. And I think it'll bore you is not the right, but you'll be surprised at how big the controversy was when, in a world of Theranos and Donald Trump as president, how kind of unremarkable the controversy of the Parker had was. And Brad Feld. Brad Feld's a very famous venture capitalist. It was lovely to have him on. He has a very specific thesis. We talked about Black Lives Matter in a way that he hasn't, but he's in Boulder. And he has a book out and a thesis that venture capital writ large, and you've heard this a million times, it's not just going to happen in Silicon Valley. And he makes the case for why it can happen in other cities around the world. Talking his own book, of course, he's in Boulder, Colorado. Then we have a couple entrepreneurs. Dom Holland is building a login and checkout platform. This is just a great story of an entrepreneur who's working hard to make something happen. This is one of the first podcasts where I saw somebody sitting alone in a big empty office, and he's just been a lovely guy. There's all kinds of CEOs and entrepreneurs, and he is he's one of the nice ones. And not that you have to be nice to be a successful CEO. There's guys who are tough and, remote, and that works too, but lovely guy. Garrett Smallwood, another CEO. Interesting one. He runs the WAG Labs. This is confusing, and I think I mentioned it. I gotta get this worked out. The WAG hotels for animals and the WAG dog walking service are two different companies. Yeah, so, but this is interesting. What happened to that business? The dog walking business as COVID hit, it pretty massively declined. Although I wonder now if people are just, we have a puppy at home, and sometimes that puppy needs to be out of the house with someone else so we can get a couple things done. Dina Shacker, as I said, wanted to have as many women as possible on this podcast, and probably have had more than any other Silicon Valley podcast as a percentage, and need to do better still next year. Dina Shacker has been promoted to partner at Lux Capital. And, so many of these stories are immigrant stories, and she's not the immigrant. Her parents are Muslim American, and she talks what it's like about being a Muslim American, making your way into and certainly up the ladder at Lux Capital in Silicon Valley. Rob Chestnut, this one's a great one. Rob Chestnut was until recently the general counsel at Airbnb. And and before that, he was close to the, general counsel at eBay and involved with trust and safety at Uber. He's a alpha dog legal guy for Silicon Valley. And he talks about what Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, says when they start getting in trouble for racism by their hosts, and sort of the distinction that it's interesting that their CEO makes between their legal responsibility and their ethical responsibility. William Davidow, just a thoughtful guy. So he founded the Moore Davidow venture firm. Before that was one of the leaders of the firm Intel. Incredible career, incredible venture capitalist. And he's thought very deeply about the future of humans, the future of work. He's one of those guys who takes his time to answer your questions, because he knows that what he says is interesting and profound and doesn't give a damn. Just a great guy, and really interesting. I had a couple people, I was surprised to hear this because it's not a particularly emotional podcast, but say that this episode made them fairly emotional. Trey Vassallo, great, another woman. If you listen to this podcast, you think that half the venture capitalists in the world are women. It's not true. But Trey has built she talks about what that name means, a very successful venture capital firm. Trey, here's a thread in the Silicon Valley, in the Something Ventured podcast, that all the women were at Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm, had a ton of amazing, Mary Meeker and Trey Vassallo, Aileen Lee, all of them have gone on and started really successful venture capital firms. What's that about? I'll leave that to you to kind of puzzle over. Sarah Leary. Sarah Leary is the co-founder of Nextdoor, and she explains in this podcast how they started out doing. Who is it? Is it Reid Hoffman, or is it? Ben Horowitz, who talks about doing things that don't scale early on. They definitely did that at Nextdoor, and she's now a venture capitalist, and she talks about how Nextdoor answers the question, why is there a white van on my street parked the wrong way? Jacqueline Hester. So Brad Feld has a partner. You remember Brad Feld from earlier on, and that's Jacqueline Hester, and that is the story of how a woman goes from being a lawyer and being in Boston. I think I'm getting that right. I'm a West Coast guy. Boston, New York, I get them all mixed up. How she ended up in Boulder, Colorado, how she ended up as a venture capitalist. Hooman Radford. Just a couple more, folks. Hooman Radford. Hooman, what a great guy. Was a venture capitalist. A perfectly good job, I'm here to attest. And he left that job to start a company. It's an immigrant story. And, so many of the stories that I tell, I didn't plan it that way, but they're immigrant stories. And he realized, and this is something I've talked about a few times on the podcast, that most entrepreneurs in this country are not Brian Chesky starting Airbnb. That's a fabulous part of the American story. But most of them are people, immigrants, starting a dry cleaning service, which requires you to start a business and market it and operate it and pay taxes and do all the things associated with it. He calls it the business of one, and he has built a business, which I can't imagine what would be more appropriate in COVID as many people go try to start their own thing, although obviously a lot of things are getting shut down too in terms of small businesses. Company called Collective, Human Radford. In the last 2 of the year, Jeff John Roberts, he is a writer. He's got a book coming out, The Kings of Crypto, and it's about Coinbase and the rise of cryptocurrency, going back to when in the open air of New York City, Wall Street traders and crypto nerds would basically trade crypto. Cash would go from the traders to the nerds, and the nerds would give them, I guess, thumb drive, a disk. I don't know how they did it. Crypto and Bitcoin is one of those things that kind of cavitates, as a story on Something Ventured, between being complete flash in the pan nonsense, which is possible, and being something big, to transformative like the internet. And it's weird that it occupies this sort of, Heidegger, that kind of binary thing where I don't know if it's the biggest thing ever or if it's just a flash in the pan. What I do know is that if you have a Bitcoin, if you have 100 Bitcoin, if you mined them or bought them for 10 cents, you can sell them today for $18,000, actual US dollars, and spend that on actual US dollar stuff. So that was Jeff John. And then we ended the year with Stacy Bishop. She is another female venture capitalist we had a chance to talk to. And I'll leave you with this thought. She highlights and says she wants to educate people on a group called All Raise. And as I kind of reflect through the women I've had on, to the men I've had on who've been thoughtful podcast, remember? All Raise has come up a number of times, and I won't explain what it is here. You can look it up. But an organization where a group of women came together, Aileen Lee largely credited for starting it. I think I'm getting that right. But a group of women who came together to support each other in a way they hadn't before. And it's remarkable on this podcast, the number of women who have mentioned and credited All Raise with their success or the success of others that they've helped. That's it, folks. That's the 2020 guests, and I want to say thank you to each of you. Thank you. Steve Martin joke. I want to say thank you. You guys have been great. I think I know we're going to have a bunch of great guests in the new year, and I want to thank you for listening. I appreciate it. This has been the Something Venture podcast. Thank you. Talk to you next time.